So it's a journey of maturation. It's not just spending time on the planet. There is an actual process of development and maturing that makes you a human being.
Yes.
And which also explains why for millennia there have been all kinds of different methods and practices that support people to go through that process of maturation. Something that in Western culture is often ignored in terms of the personal and interpersonal development. You have to pick it up on the go. So you say, for example, that everybody needs a contemplative practice, and there are many different ones, but maybe you can say again more, what do you mean by contemplative practice, and what is this contemplative practice actually doing for leaders in the world that do work?
In Western traditions, you'd probably call it something like contemplative practice. In Eastern, you'd call it more meditative practice. But you have the same problem either way. What do you mean? How do you even define meditation or contemplation? Or reflection, which is a word we often use a little more often because it's a little bit less confusing to people. But even reflection is not clear. I mean, in terms of practice, as you say, because when all is said and done, this is not a philosophy or a bunch of intellectualizing. These are either really useful practices or they're not going to go anywhere. I mean, our work is always in the context of real organizations, businesses, schools, networks of organizations trying to work together on very complex change aspirations. So you have to really be able to integrate into the day-to-day in the context in which people are operating. And so you always find at least three levels, and sometimes you might even say there could be a fourth of practices. The first are personal. And I do think in some sense, since this is all about the journey of becoming human, there needs to be a personal grounding. What do I do? And there I think today, probably more so than any other time in human history, we have an extraordinary variety of things to kind of choose from. Because, for most of human history, people grew up locally. They grew up in the context of their own history, their own cultural history, and they had access to whatever was present in their culture. That's obviously still true, but now, for 3 generations, there's been a huge increase in interest in Buddhism and Taoism in the West. Well, that wouldn't have been possible 75 or 100 years ago. There's a lot of crossing of boundaries now, and I think the fun thing about that is, since every set of practices that's historic is embedded in a historic context, it's embedded in a set of cultural associations, and it's often very useful to be able to disassociate that so you can get kind of the essence of the practice. I spent a lot of time in China, and China is very interesting if you look at it historically, because it has 3 intertwined historical disciplinary threads. Taoism is the oldest. Taoism goes back to basically the indigenous people of China. You find native peoples all around the world. They relate very directly to Taoism because it's about the earth as alive, and it's about how I understand the physical mind-body system. The source of all Chinese medicine is in the Taoist traditions. The I Ching is the oldest artifact of Chinese culture, but that probably sits 10,000 years after the basic ideas of Taoism started to come together. So it's very ancient, and it's very physically centered. The simple definition of cultivation or practice in the Taoist tradition is to transform the energetic system so that one can achieve enlightenment. But you start with this, what they would call the mind-heart system, this energetic system. Buddhism is very mentally centered. It's obviously the most recent of those traditions in China. It's only like 1700 years old when it comes from India and Southeast Asia. And then the third, which in many ways in traditional Chinese culture at its best, connected them all, was Confucianism. At its roots, and that saying I used before, to become a leader, you must first become a human being, comes from the Confucian tradition. Confucianism is a set of ideas and practices for cultivation, developing as a human being in a social context. So there the focus is very much on relationships. And so that kind of gives a bit of also an overview of the different types of cultivation practices. There's all kinds of ones that are physically centered. There's yoga. There's Tai Chi. There's the Eastern ones. There's Western ones. The main difference is in the West now, it's mostly today exercise. But yoga is much more than exercise. Yoga, people would say traditionally, was to actually prepare yourself physically in order to be able to meditate. To have the body be able to be quiet, to have it be clean, clear, so that the mind could really enter a different and quieter state. But there's always these personal and physically centered. Then I believe there really are a set of interpersonal practices. In any organizational setting, you say, well, where do we start? We always start our work as saying, well, what's the team? Anything you're trying to do in any organization, including make this little video, usually there's more than one person, right? So there's always a team. In a team, we've always defined a team as a group of people who need one another to get something done. Very simple, very generic definitions, not just formal teams. But if you look at work that way, there's always a network of kind of core relationships without which no way we're going to be able to produce what we're producing right now. I find that a very good entry point in most organizational contexts is focusing on teams. Because from that, you can clearly get back to the individual. How is it that I'm operating that's undermining the team? What are the challenges I'm faced with? Because this person over here I think is a complete idiot, and we don't think at all alike, but I could look at that as about him, or I could also look at it as about me. So the team context is basically families in organizations, right? It's that intermediate scale of complexity where there's a rich tableau of human relationships and a lot of personal stuff that gets brought up. If you look at something like the fifth discipline, I would say 3/4 of the practical ideas in that whole tradition are really about how to make teams work better. And the reason for that is very, very practical. One, that's where work gets done. Individuals do not produce work. And two, if you want to get onto some sort of a deep transformational, cultivation, developmental path, you better start there. Because if you say we're going to transform our organization, CEOs love to say, we're in this great transformation journey, and say, well, how is your team working? Oh, I haven't thought about that. You're just dealing with abstractions. Because you don't have a way to bring it down to reality, but bring it to reality at the level there's some genuine interpersonal complexity. Because that's what a team represents. And of course, the next level would be that of an organization as a whole or an institution. Increasingly, we do a lot of work in all kinds of networks, particularly those that cross organizations. A lot of our projects today are on value chains, because I really believe we'll be finding social and environmental issues becoming more and more part of business, because people have to manage their value chains in a way that you really look at the whole of it. If you're in the food business, the health of that farming community is your business. You didn't think about that traditionally because you bought food from a supplier. But that supplier bought food from somebody, who bought food from somebody, or bought fish from somebody. So if you're not thinking about the whole of that system, you don't have a system that's going to be viable in all likelihood. And that's true in all the food industry. I think there's a big wake-up in the food industry today. And the last level, you might say, would be beyond individual or obvious connections of institutions, individual institutions, or obvious connection, which is really, you might say, more the contextual industry, societies, the regional groupings, where you have many different industries and types of organizations. When you look at, for example, food systems, eventually you get to the health and well-being of a farming community or a fishing community. Well, that's a regional perspective that then pulls in all the industries, all the businesses, the schools, the families, the whole, everything is there. I'd say everything in our society is there in microcosm in any geographic locale. So that's the hardest one to get your arms around. But the truth is, they're all a progression, but it really helps to understand the progression.
On our website, globalleadership.tv, you will find additional footage, other dialogues with innovation leaders from around the world, and also the hands-on practices that help them and their organizations to move from inspiration to real change.